Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this wonderful hall, Gaston. I also want to welcome a set of people who aren't in Gaston, but who are joining us via a webcast and participating in the conversation we'll have on social media later. I welcome you all. We have an extraordinary panel with us today to share different academic disciplinary insights regarding the recent events in Ferguson. Following their conversation here on stage, our audience members, you out there, are invited to question the panelists, to do follow-up questions to one or more of those speakers. And I'll say a few more things about that in a moment. It's also clear to us over the last few days that the energy among our faculty and staff and students to continue discussions on these issues is pretty strong. And today we only have an hour and a half. That won't be enough. Hence, we think of this as the first of other sessions, and some of them may be more like speak-outs than an academic discourse that we're having today. To open our discussion, President John J. DeGioia will offer some reflections about the importance of this moment, of why our university is engaging in these conversations and how we wish to engage. In short, what characteristics inform and shape our approach. Please join me in welcoming President DeGioia. Thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. I want to extend my most sincere appreciation to our colleagues who will be leading us in this conversation today. We're gathered here in Gaston Hall, as we have at moments throughout our history, to seek a greater understanding of the events unfolding around us. In recent weeks, many of us have been deeply affected by the events surrounding the tragic shooting of a young man in Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown. And we come together today to do what our university does best, to engage the expertise of our faculty in conversation on issues of significance in our world. A university provides us with a place, both a setting and a context in which to do this work. Ours is a setting in which young people, our students, join our community. They come to share a home on our campus during a profound moment in their lives. And they come here to engage in the kind of formation that is grounded in the pursuit of knowledge and that is animated by a commitment to serve the common good. We do this on our campus in this place together. Our university provides resources that are animated by our tradition as a Catholic and Jesuit university. These resources, a commitment to the pursuit of truth, the importance of practicing contemplation in action, of seeking social justice through service to others, provide a foundation upon which we engage in this work of dialogue. We stand together in dialogue. Our community is sustained by our commitment to dialogue, dialogue that is open to new experiences of formation, new forms of knowledge and inquiry, new ways of engaging our world. We bring with us to this work a sense of hope, a hope that reflects the spirit in which our nation was founded, and a hope that accepts the responsibility to address the continuing fault line of our republic, the endurance, the persistence of racism and discrimination. In this, the 50th year since Freedom Summer, and the 50th year since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the 50th year since Dr. King won his Nobel Prize. We're reminded of just how much work remains to realize this promise. We begin this work in dialogue, animated by a sense of care and compassion for each other. We are asked, guided by the spirit of St. Ignatius, to presuppose the very best in one another, to seek out the best in one another, and in so doing, we will find the best in ourselves. This is a special moment for our community. I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. We hope you'll join us in future conversations as we continue this important dialogue. It's now my privilege to turn this back over to Provost Groves and our distinguished group of colleagues.
Shock, pain, anger, loss of hope, fatigue. These are some of the emotions that are easy to feel on many days as we collectively live through times of conflict and tumult. Throughout the world, different races and cultures and language groups are living closer to one another, are interacting and cohabiting within societies in ways that were impossible to consider decades ago. But every day we read stories about intergroup conflicts throughout the world. Here in the US, the Great Recession of 2008 appears to have hurt those in the lower socioeconomic groups much more than others. And we know that inequality is increasing towards unprecedented rates. Despite legal protections put in place 50 years ago, we still witness an inability to free ourselves of the legacy of slavery as poverty and restricted educational opportunities continue to be fractured along racial lines. And then in Ferguson, we've all seen video images that shocked us. Another life cut down, never to fulfill its promise. And so it's understandable that our first responses are emotional. As we continue to reflect, we must engage new ideas and perspectives that deepen our understanding. So it is appropriate, we think, that we bring to bear at this moment, at this time, all the knowledge and wisdom of those who've devoted their lives to the study of race and intergroup relations. On this stage, we have historians, sociologists, political scientists, and experts in law and policy. And we've asked them here to teach us what their fields have learned about these issues, to help each of us have a deeper understanding of recent events in the context of the accumulated knowledge of the past decades. I want to begin by introducing our panel, and I'll go from left to right. First, Paul Butler, professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center with expertise in civil rights and discrimination law. He teaches in the area of criminal law and race and the law. His book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice, received the Harry Chapin Media Award. Professor Butler also received a Soros Justice Fellowship, which funds projects that advance reform, spur debate, and catalyze change in the US criminal justice system. To his right, Marcia Chatelain is Assistant Professor of History, active in the African American Studies program, and she made me say this, a proud graduate of the University of Missouri. Tigers, right? Tigers. Dr. Chatelain writes and teaches about African American migration, women's and girls' history, and food studies. Her new book, to be released in the spring, is South Side Girls, growing up in the Great Migration. Dr. Shadlin also launched the hashtag Ferguson syllabus Twitter campaign as a way for educators throughout the country to share ideas on how to talk about Ferguson in their classroom. To her right, Michael Eric Dyson, University Professor of Sociology of Georgetown. He teaches courses on the sociology of hip hop and race and the president. He is author of over 17 books, including Making Malcolm, The Myth and Meaning of Malcolm X, Holler If You Hear Me, Searching for Tupac Shakur, and Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina and the Color of Disaster, the latter which received the American Book Award. Professor Dyson's work bridges gaps between generations, connecting civil rights identity, hip-hop culture, while forging links between older and younger Americans, especially Black Americans. To his right, Peter Edelman is a professor of law at Georgetown Law Center, co-director of the Joint Degree in Law and Public Policy, faculty director of the Center of Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy. Professor Edelman's expertise includes constitutional law, legislation, and social welfare. His most recent book, So Rich, So Poor, Why It's So Hard to End Poverty in America. To his right, Maurice Jackson, Associate Professor in the History Department and African American Studies program, and an affiliated professor of music. He teaches courses in the history of the Atlantic world, the Black diaspora, Black politics and culture. He's the author of Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benezet, Father of Atlantic Abolitionism. He's also been recently appointed as the first chair of the DC Commission on African American Affairs. And finally, to his right, Doug Reed, Associate Professor in the Government Department, Director of the Program on Education, Inquiry, and Justice, teaching courses on civil rights and civil liberties. This summer, Oxford University Press published his most recent book, Building the Federal Schoolhouse, Localism and the American Education State. So we have the benefit today, if we take advantage of it, of hearing from scholars of law, history, sociology, and political science. And I must say we are privileged to be able to have such scholars in our community, and I thank them on very short notice for coming today. In a real way, our goal today is to pick their brains, to transfer to us some of the knowledge and perspective that they acquired over years of study. And in a real way, this is Georgetown's attempt at reflection on Ferguson to make sure we place them in a context that's fully informed by the best scholarship among our faculty. So the format today is that we will ask the panelists to give us their reflections based on what their field of inquiry informs about the underlying issues at hand. And then we'll ask them about their thoughts on what a university like Georgetown should do at this moment in history going forward. How can we help this country we live in? Then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. Here's a bit how we'll organize the questions. I have to say this now. As usual, we'll have a microphone in the center aisle, but we've also distributed cards. Did you get cards as you walked in? And they're really designed to be able for you to write down questions that you want asked, even while the panel is going on. We'll collect those cards, and then we'll use those to organize the question. We'll probably rotate back and forth between the mic and the card-based questions. One final word. we've assembled some of the best speakers in America up here. I have extracted from them the promise that they're going to do 5 minutes blurbs in order to maximize the time we have together between now and 5:30. They've agreed to this discipline, and I'll help them along with that discipline. Our goal is to hear as many voices as we can today. So when we get to the question and answer period, the more we're succinct in our dialogue, the more people that can be heard, and that's what we're after. So I think we're ready to begin, and Paul, if you'd like to start.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Butler, and I represent the United States. That's how I used to start my opening statement. I represented the government here in criminal court in the District of Columbia, and I used that power to put a lot of black people in prison, and Latino people, and poor people. Like a lot of prosecutors, that was pretty much all I did. During the time I did that work, I learned some things that changed the ways that I felt about my responsibilities as an American, as an African American, and as a person who wants to make a difference in this world. So for just a couple of minutes, I'm going to tell you about what I learned about criminal law and how it relates to Ferguson. So the law is complicated, it's ambiguous, and sometimes it's even conflicting. And that's true in part because the law comes from many sources. Those sources are political, they're raced, and they're gendered. So the Constitution is one source of law, the Supreme Court is another, Congress is a third, sometimes the police are colloquially called the law, and then there's the law of the streets. And for those of us who want justice in Ferguson, some of this law is not on our side. The Supreme Court has said, in a series of cases that started the last time there were urban insurrections in the United States in the 1960s, the court began this project to expand police power. So in cases since the 60s, the court has said that the police can lie to you, they can arrest you for minor traffic offenses like not wearing a seatbelt or driving with an expired license. The police can start chasing you, even for a minor offense. And if you, in fleeing, cause a danger, then they can kill you. The police can detain you, even if they believe you're trying to, the police can detain you if they believe you're trying to avoid them in a high crime area, even if they don't have any reason to suspect you of a crime. And they can force you to stop just to investigate why you don't want to talk to them. My criminal law students had the opportunity to go on a ride along with a DC cop to show my students how much power he has. He has this game that he plays with them called Pick a Car. So my student is riding in the squad car with this officer. He tells them to pick any other car on the road and he will stop it. So the student will say that silver BMW over there. Now this is a good cop. He waits for a legal reason. He waits until he has a legal reason to stop. But it never takes more than 3 or 4 blocks of following before the driver commits some traffic infraction. Then the officer can stop the car, order the driver and passenger out, and if he fears for his safety, he can even frisk them. We don't have to give the police this much power, but this is what the conservative members of the Supreme Court have chosen to do. And we now know that the consequences are deadly. So the Supreme Court made it possible for the police to stop Eric Garner on Staten Island for the crime of selling untaxed cigarettes, which, as the whole world knows, led to his being placed in an illegal chokehold and killed. The Supreme Court made it possible for the police to stop Michael Brown for the crime of walking in the street, which, as the whole world knows, led to them shooting him 6 times. Congress is another source of law. So remember those images from last week in Ferguson with tanks in the street and police officers wearing camouflage, throwing stun grenades at protesters? The police were able to do that because of a law Congress passed called Section 1033 of the National Defense Reauthorization Act. That law provides police officers with surplus military equipment for free. So through this program, LA County, just one police department, got 3,400 assault rifles, 1,600 pieces of body armor, 15 helicopters, and 7 armored vehicles. Last year in Bloomington, Alabama, which has a population of about 3,000, the police got 4 grenade launchers. Almost $4 billion in equipment designed to be used in war that's going to local police department. And here's the kicker. Under this law, when these departments get this equipment, they have to use it within a year. Otherwise, they have to give it back to the Pentagon. So think of the perverse incentives that provides the police. Now, I just have a minute left, so the law also gives us some tools to fight back. The First Amendment, for example, allows us to film the police. It also gives us the right to protest. I want us to think, as the provost raised, how much all of these problems are related to ongoing problems, not just in criminal justice, but of economic inequality and and racial inequality. So think of $100. $100. The median net worth of an unmarried white man in this country is over $71,000. For an unmarried white woman, it's $41,000. For an unmarried black woman, $100. Unmarried Latino woman, $100. So when I think about being here at Georgetown and our strong commitment to social justice and our Jesuit values, when we get outraged at all of the ways in which Black life is devalued, I think that's when we take Ferguson from a moment to a movement.
Hello, everyone. As the provost said, I'm a proud graduate of the University of Missouri. And as the events in Ferguson unfolded, I thought about all the tax-paying citizens of Missouri who helped finance my education and the possibility that very few kids from Ferguson would ever have the opportunity to get the education I did at the University of Missouri. And I was thinking about the perverse system that we have normalized in that, right? It's just bodies paying taxes. As a historian, you can become arrogant and think that you know the way events are going to turn. Another use of excessive police force, another spectacular show of a lack of leadership at various levels, and another moment in which our nation finds itself at a crossroads. We have a choice, and we've had many choices, and we often turn away. Yet, I would be a bad historian if I didn't highlight some of the remarkable elements of the story of Ferguson. And so I just wanted to talk about 4 things that I saw in Ferguson that gives me hope that this is more than just another story. First, the restlessness of the people on the ground in rain and hot weather. Historically, civil unrest is often ended by a change in the weather. And through rain and through 100-degree-plus weather, the people of Ferguson continued to show up. And I think that's an indication to us how much was at stake at that moment. The second one is the clear representation of media repression and the fear of social media to expose what was happening to journalists. I think that when Ferguson unfolded, I thought about the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles. I thought about the way that cable news capitalized on this moment, but I don't remember images of police forces dismantling television cameras, of reporters talking about the level of police brutality and that the right of the press not respected at all. And so I think that this is an important moment for us to think about that frame. The other thing that I found remarkable was the convergence of movements. You had folks from Occupy, you had Sandy Hook families, you had Dream Defenders, you had the heads of major LGBT organizations making very clear statements about the intersectional nature of what was happening in Ferguson. There are many moments where we often think that the same cast of characters are going to respond to Ferguson, but I think that there was something really beautiful in that moment in which national organizations that didn't have to take up this cause did it anyway because they understood that they were linked to the people of Ferguson. The other thing I'd like to note is perhaps a little self-aggrandizing, but I think scholars played such an important role in helping shape the narrative and the discourse of how we talk about Ferguson. Due to a new generation of scholars, and I hope that I can count myself among that group, we no longer think of civil unrest as the problem of sociologists, but the problem of all engaged people. So the way that everyday people were saying the militarization of the police, the sophisticated nature in which you saw young elected officials of color representing the people of Ferguson and making very clear claims of citizenship, that isn't possible without the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and a new generation of college professors who are teaching people the way to understand themselves in relationship to citizenship. And that is no small thing. And so I think that it's important to also note that we're seeing this from an interdisciplinary lens, right? That this isn't just an economic problem, and this is just not a problem for lawyers, but it's a problem for all of us. And the last thing that I want to say is that there's this enduring legacy that we're always grappling with, and that's the force of change versus continuity over time. And I think that the leadership that Georgetown has demonstrated in this moment is going to be the type of leadership that the students here have the opportunity to demonstrate the next time we're confronted with our racial past.
I want to thank President DeGioia and Provost Groves for this wonderful opportunity to join these brilliant scholars to talk about this. From my perspective, from social theory, and as a Baptist preacher, I have 3 points. First one is poverty. Poverty is critical to the situation that occurred in Ferguson. As has been indicated, the concentration of poor people has had a devastating effect far before the eruption in Ferguson. When you think about the fact that 22% of the people who are there are poor, a city that has quickly gone from a predominantly white suburb to a predominantly black suburb, nearly 67% of the city is black, and yet the police force is overwhelmingly white, the mayor is white, the governor is white, and that has made for an extremely excruciating conflict between the people who live there and the people who are occupied. We were very sympathetic to notions of Occupy Wall Street, and yet the occupation of social and urban space by police forces has been incredible, but the poor people who are surveilled, who are scrutinized, who are pathologized, who are made to seem as if they are somehow accidental to the very understanding of America as a nation. They are inessential workers in the product of democracy. And we know this because those people's rights are not respected. Their ability to live and flourish without the encumbrances of over-policing is relatively devastating. And the poverty that is grinding, that has not yet been exactly spoken about before this, this Michael Brown situation where he was murdered as an unarmed black youth. So when we think about that poverty, we think about the fact, and I know Professor Edelman has a lot more to say about that, the grinding poverty to which people are subject leads to all sorts of problems with their employment, their relationship to their own families, the neighborhoods in which they live, the concentrated poverty that makes them subject to and vulnerable to poor schooling. All of this, the trip hammer effect, if you will, of being poor and concentrated poverty in particular, happening in a space where black people are being occupied. Number two, the police force. Now, you know, many people, Reverend Al Sharpton included, said, look, black folk are not anti-police, they're just anti-bad police. Well, the problem with the police is that when they show up, they often can't make a distinction between who is the ostensible criminal and the criminalized black person, right? They just can't make that distinction. And that's because there is a preconception of what black people are likely to do, Latino people are likely to do, even some poor white people for that matter. So the criminalization of black people is a devastating consequence of 4 centuries of rejection and repudiation of the humanity of black people. Because what we saw there was the inability to see a black person as a human being. That is not something we can pin on Ferguson. That's not something we can pin on Missouri. That's something that has been produced within the bowels of American democratic energy, and the inability to recognize the humanity of black people linked to the Constitution, linked to the Declaration of Independence, and even linked to the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court said that we have no rights that white people are bound to respect. 3/5 human, they contended we were worth. And yet, in that situation, we saw that the life of this young man, Michael Brown, was not treated with equal dignity, not only while he lived, but posthumously as his body laid in the street for some 4 hours or more. This is the difference between fast terror, dropping a bomb, shooting guns, and devastating an entire community, and slow terror, the everyday form of existence under the police occupation that has devastated and terrorized black communities. It is not hyperbolic. If we want to do theoretically, we could talk about Michel Foucault and the way in which power is distributed and exercised between peoples. Not just big people in high offices, but everyday people, the microaggressions that often lead to murder. And finally, privilege. One of the big elephants in the room is white privilege. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to make people uncomfortable. And white privilege is not simply pointing the finger at white people and saying, aha. No, it's not even about that. And some, white people, most of whom don't run the world, who say, look, I'm not privileged. I don't have much money. And all of which is true. But if you have the privilege, when you interact with a policeman, that they assume you're human, and that they do not presume to contain you because of contaminated stereotypes about your being, the greatest privilege is not wealth. The greatest privilege is not money. The greatest privilege is to be presumed as a human being, to be treated with dignity, and therefore to live.
So I get to go next. I'm Peter Edelman. I'm on the law faculty of this wonderful university. I want to join Michael in thanking President DeGioia, Provost Groves, for doing this. The most important thing is that we at Georgetown are showing respect. We're showing solidarity. We're showing our connection to the tragedy that happened. And if we said nothing else, that would be enough. There's so much to be said. There's so much that's already been said, but the first and most important point is that an unarmed man died. That should not have happened. There was no need to kill an unarmed man. And equally important, why is it that almost every unarmed man killed by police officers in our country is African American? Why? There's a long list of issues here. Race and poverty, the largest issues that we could think of and confront in our country. I'll just mention a few specific things. One is about the police. With all respect for the police officers of all races in our country who enforce the law for the common good, Ferguson is just the latest in a long line. And in terms of students who are here at Georgetown and learning in an academic context about the history of our country and the history of these issues, almost every instance of civil unrest in the 1960s was touched off by police action in the street. It's still happening. It's still happening. Which brings us to Ferguson. Much progress on civil rights in our country, and we celebrate it, but it's a place that time forgot, especially the suburbs in our country where poverty has nearly doubled over the course of the last decade. And in this case, a town that's experienced major demographic changes, as Michael said. Dangerous combination, black majority suburb with white political control and overwhelmingly white police forces. Dangerous combination, fatal for Michael Brown. This should be, there are many things that should be teachable moments here. One should be about the police and the entire judicial system, police and courts combined, how they affect low-income people and especially low-income people of color. I always say that the intersection of race and poverty is the most dangerous place in America. And think about it in relation to Ferguson, because this is, of course, a racial issue, but we did not hear that much about the poverty. And yet, Marcia and I were talking earlier, 67% of the children in the schools in Ferguson are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Need to talk about that. Particularly good article in the New York Times yesterday about the justice system in small towns, especially in small towns, especially with regard to men and women of color. Person gets a traffic ticket, doesn't pay, often doesn't have the money, fees and further fines pile up and up. Finally, people end up in jail. It's a new kind of racial profiling. It's even more toxic, and it's happening all over our country. Just one subject for us to focus on, to look at. The other point is why in the last election in Ferguson was there only 12% coming to the polls among the population in that city. That's shameful. We have to pay attention to that. Maybe the point is that so many African-American families have come to Ferguson so recently that they haven't become a political community. I don't know. Perhaps the African-American population of Ferguson had been there not long enough to become a community. But there should have been an African-American mayor in Ferguson by now. Now, it's starting to happen. One of the things we're seeing that in Ferguson, and it should be happening all over our country. So we need to talk about all of the issues that are focused, that are brought up by this terrible tragedy: race, policing, poverty, education, jobs. And I would add that we need to talk about how we build a sense of community everywhere that brings with it a sense of cohesion and a sense of efficacy, especially political efficacy, and that puts in place elected representatives who actually represent the people whom they govern.
Thank you. I'm not used to sitting down. I'm used to sit down. On May 16, 4 months after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the New York Times published a remarkable essay titled, "What Should Be Done with the Negro?" a lecture by Frederick Douglass. It went on to say, Douglass commenced by saying that the great question before the public was, what shall be done with the Negro? Amid the conflict of opinion and the thunder of smoke and the battle, the Negro looms up and will continue to do so until the question with regard to him is settled upon the basis of justice. And then Douglass says, the only way to secure peace to the nation was to do justice to the Negro. Douglass had first raised this question when blacks in Washington, D.C. were emancipated in 1862. Yet he was not the first person to ask this question or to see the dilemma. In the first edition of the Shorter Account of Africa in 1762, by the Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet, he asked the question, what should be done with the Negroes? He called both for manumission and the education of the slaves, and he called for whites to use all reasonable endeavors to enable them to procure a comfortable living, not only as an act of justice, here we go again, justice, to the individuals, but as a debt due to them on account of the oppression and injustice perpetuated on them and their ancestors. He told whites, and I quote, that guilt and scandal would lie upon them if they failed to respond. 140 years after Benezet and 40 after Douglass, W.B. Du Bois wrote a remarkable essay of the dawn of freedom. And he said, the old question remains, what should be done with the Negroes? And rhetorically asked, what and why must they continue to be the problems of today? And he asked, how does it feel to be a problem? He asked that of blacks, and he wanted the answer. And he said, the only way is to show them and guarantee them justice. Again, the word justice. We'll skip a few years to a commencement address of Lyndon Baines Johnson, that whiskey-drinking, foul-mouthed Southern president who had the nerve to, and the guts to bring a conference in 1965 called To Fulfill These Rights. And he said, first, Negroes are trapped as many whites are trapped in inherited gateless poverty. They lack training and skills. They are shut in slums. They're without decent medical care. They're without private, and they have private and public poverty combines to cripple them. And then he said, first and most of all, white America must accept responsibility. It flows from centuries of oppression and persecution of the Negro man. It flows from the long years of degradation and discrimination. And he called for justice. And he said, you can't expect a man with a mule to catch up with a man with a caterpillar. Those old of us old of us know a caterpillar would mean a big tractor combine, not a worm. And he said, you can't expect a man to catch up with someone if he's at the first yard line and you at the 100. And he said, for what is justice? It is to fulfill the fair expectations of man. This is American justice. We have pursued it faithfully to the edge of our imperfections, and we have failed to find it for the American Negro. And then he called for a White House conference, fulfill these rights. And what I propose then is that perhaps we should take a jump on this, and that our president of our university and others should think about asking to host such a conference here at Georgetown University in 1965 to fulfill these rights which have not been fulfilled. Lastly, whenever in time of dilemma, I go back to my grandma Pearl who raised me. And her simple motto was, boy, where there's a will, there's a way. And Du Bois spoke about this. I leaned with Du Bois. He wrote a remarkable essay of the training of black men. And he could dedicate this poem, he could dedicate this to Michael Brown. He said this, herein in the longing of black men must have respect, the rich and bitter depth of their experience, the unknown treasures of their inner life, the strange renderings of nature they have seen, may give the world new points of view and make their loving, living, and doing precious to all human hearts. And to themselves in these days, the days that try their souls, the chance to soar in the dim blue air above the smoke is to their finer spirit boom and guerdon for what they may lose on earth by being black. Thank you.
I want to thank my colleagues here for your wonderful and enlightening contributions. And I want to thank you all for coming, and both President DeGioia and Provost Groves for convening us all here. I want to think a little bit about what's to come, right? Let's think about the legal process that's to come, and if Darren Wilson is indicted, what kind of defense would he make? He would make a defense that the shooting of Michael Brown was a legitimate use of force because he had reasonable or rational fear of being harmed by Michael Brown. And given historical precedents, that defense would probably be sufficient under existing Supreme Court doctrines about the use of force by police, as Professor Butler alluded. But we need to go beyond that. We need to understand, why would that be a reasonable fear? What would make it reasonable for a police officer to shoot an unarmed 18-year-old? And how is that, quote, rationality the product of public policy? What is the kind of isolation, the kind of lack of understanding between police force and the community that creates this kind of reasonableness that makes that fear, quote unquote, legitimate? We had a police force in this town that had 3 African-American officers out of 53 members in a context of a roughly 60% African-American population. We have residential segregation within St. Louis that is probably some of the worst in the nation. How does that create and sustain the othering of Michael Brown as someone who's worthy of being shot or deserves to be shot because he presents a fear to a police officer? And what kind of school segregation is required to ensure that Michael Brown attends a virtually all-black school? And what are the futures that that all-black school holds for his peers in Ferguson? How is that segregation built and sustained? You all know the story of Brown versus Board of Education, but you may not know that Schools in the Northeast and the Midwest are now more segregated than they were at the time of Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation is worse in the United States today, in many parts of the country, than it was in that time period, 1950. And the story of that transformation comes about as the Supreme Court begins to undo integration. A series of decisions in the 1980s start the process, and then most recently in 2007, in the Seattle and Louisville cases, the Supreme Court prevents these cities from using race to actively integrate their student populations. Why does the Supreme Court do that? Because it values what it calls colorblind statutes, colorblind 14th Amendment jurisprudence. In this sense, to use race at all is a violation of the Constitution. But I think the thing that we really need to come to grips with is that the failure to actually be cognizant of race, to understand race, and to build race into public policy in a progressive way confines us to segregation. It confines us to a series of public policy decisions that are unable to create the communities where that, quote, rationality doesn't exist, okay? There's a terrific book, I'm going to take a little digression, called American Apartheid. Douglas Massey and Mary Denton, I believe, talks about how integrated communities do not last very long, primarily because of difference of perceptions of whites and blacks about what an integrated community looks like. African Americans, according to Massey and Denton, generally find a community that's about 50-50, black and white, as one that's integrated. Whites generally don't like it much more above 30%. As that population becomes more increasingly African American, whites start leaving because they feel it's not integrated anymore. It's becoming predominantly black. Just at the time that African Americans saying this is increasingly a desirable community for them to live in. Those are distributed preferences that, unless we can take race into account and build policies that actually promote integration, we are going to be fighting against them. So Ferguson, to my mind, represents not necessarily the past or historical precedents of abuse of police, of racialized violence, but in some ways, if we continue to adhere to colorblind jurisprudence, it represents, sadly, the future. It represents a future in which public policy does not have the tools to build integrated communities, to take into account the kinds of things that my colleagues have been talking about to overcome poverty, and particularly racialized poverty. As a result, those conditions grow worse and worse over time. And I wanted to thank you for the indulgence there. Thanks.
So before we open it up, I thought it would be useful to pose one other question, and it's about universities at this moment in time. What can and should universities be doing, a university like Georgetown? What are the attributes of those institutions that can really be a force for good? So if you had to choose one thing at this moment to argue that this is the moment for universities to do, what would it be? Paul?
So when I was a student at a university, I came to the understanding that the personal is political. And I learned that from great thinkers like Audre Lorde and Dorothy Day, and from another great philosopher, Michael Jackson, who said that if you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make that change. So starting with the man in the mirror, my name is Paul Butler, and I have biases. Paul Butler has biases. Everybody's a little bit racist. That means me, and that means you. But we don't have to let those biases define us or defeat us. So one thing we can do is to Google Harvard Implicit Association Test. Harvard Implicit Association Test, and there you will find, it's almost like a video game, a way to measure the different kinds of biases you have, and then some suggestions about how not to let those biases control you. A couple of other things also having to do with the personal. White folks, you should go out of your way to have more friends of color. The Washington Post had a story this week. The average white person has one black friend, one Latino friend, and one Asian American friend. The average black person, on the other hand, has 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, no Asian friends. So we can all do better. We also can hold our university to its commitment to diversity. We need more students of color and faculty members of color. The law school where I'm privileged to teach used to be one of the primary sources of African American lawyers in this country. We're not doing as well on that measure as we once were. We're doing better this year than we did last year, which is good, but we all need to do better. And lastly, and this is more political, we need to make our leaders more accountable on race, starting with President Obama. Now, when he was elected, I don't think anyone thought that 400 years, a legacy of 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow apartheid would be reversed, but there was measured optimism that he would make racial justice an important part of his platform, and he has not. Now, when he reluctantly talks about race, it often seems more like he's explaining to white people how black people feel. So we need less translation and more real leadership. At his press conference, when he talked about Michael Brown, the president pointed to his My Brother's Keepers program, which provides mentoring and skills training to young black and Latino men. Well, first of all, that program is insufficient because it's only for boys and men. It's not racial justice. It's not racial justice if it leaves out half the race. And secondly, the program is too focused on fixing black men, getting them to pull up their pants. What we learned from Ferguson is that black men are not the problem. So Michael Brown was supposed to start college the week after Officer Wilson killed him. Trayvon Martin was on his way to his dad's house when George Zimmerman shot him dead. These young men don't need role models, they need lives. And that's why My Brother's Keeper is incomplete. It's not the brothers who need fixing, it's the keepers. Barack Obama is a brilliant man, and if he used the last 2 years of his presidency to focus on racial and economic inequality, what a wonderful legacy that would be.
Marcia, what?
In terms of what universities could do, we've seen a lot of progress in some ways in the recruitment of students of color and faculty of color. But one of the things that I would advise is that we no longer look at diversity in the frame of contempt or pity, but instead move towards community. And I say that because I think sometimes we find race talk on the university a problem that needs to be solved rather than a challenge that can be engaged by the capacity of all of the members in the community. And so I think that the next step is to change the cast of characters who are asked about these moments, right? We don't all live in Ferguson, but we continue to live with the consequences of Ferguson no matter where we are. And so I think that that's important. And the second thing I would add is that there's a real need for us to understand the terms of liberation. A college degree, a graduate degree, a good job, a house in the suburbs, a very nice car, people who love you, these are not enough to protect you from the slow terror that Dr. Dyson talks about. And so as a community, how do we train our students to be the types of citizens who don't vote for the segregated school system, who know so much about the violence that a poor education does to a child that they can't even fathom the possibility when they go back to their home districts and vote. And so I think that This is such a beautiful moment, and this makes me feel very inspired about our capacity to really rethink what a problem is and the various ways we can get to a solution.
You know, one of the great privileges we have as scholars, intellectuals, teachers, is that we have a platform with our students to be able to hash out the stuff that makes us angry, upset, ticked off, energized. And this is a great privilege to talk to our students because they help us understand what we're thinking. Dr. Johnson said, or I stand to be corrected if it wasn't him, that I don't know what I think until I begin to write. Well, we don't really know who we are until we begin to teach and learn and listen and inform each other. So the fact of us speaking about this openly is incredibly important. Think about it. August 28th, March on Washington. Before that, Emmett Till, right? Think about that. After that, Hurricane Katrina. These are signal moments in the ongoing epic struggle of America against its worst defining traits within its own beast, within its own belly, within its own breast. And so we have that opportunity to really struggle to clarify these issues so we can deal with them, number one. Number two, I think that as I listen to both Professor Chatelain and Professor Butler, it's so right that we identify within ourselves those things that are problematic and in society without feeling that there's a functional equivalence between all biases ain't created equal. Your bias against green hair or red skin or brown identity, right, is not equal. So the biases we possess have to be rigorously, as our Professor Butler said, subject to the scrutiny of our own analysis that allows us to see that just because everybody is biased, therefore, hey, if you get rid of your biases, I get rid of mine, the problems will be solved. No, because there are some objective empirical beliefs and practices that mitigate against the metastasizing, in the positive sense, of democracy across bodies in America. So we have to confront our own undignified biases as well as the actually existing conditions of social terror and racial injustice that prevail. And also, finally, I think what's very important is that when we can be specific to our particular claim, but not exclusive. I never want to give up race specificity, but I do want to give up race exclusivity, right? I'm going to be particular and specific about race, but gender plays a hell of a role too. Sexual orientation plays a hell of a role because a poor black woman is poorer than many other people who are poor, and a poor black person is poorer than many white people because of concentrated poverty. So that those differences are not just the, as Elizabeth Spellman says, the additive version. We'll just add on some other stuff to make you even more minority. No. We have to acknowledge the degree to which our own understanding of struggle has to be informed by others so that there are black people who are, look, diversity is not diversity for its own sake. Diversity is diversity toward equality. Because if you've got a black, Latino, Asian American, and Native person who are all agreeing on the fact that gay people should be marginalized, that's diversity toward injustice. You have to have diversity toward justice. And for me, that means that we ask serious questions about the hostile conditions that many of our fellow citizens exist in, and we also challenge our own beliefs and biases because we come to school and we listen to our students and they challenge us and they inform us and they give us something important. Now, I end by saying this. I want to steal this idea from Professor Maurice Jackson, because it's a great idea, and join it with what Professor Butler said. Our president is a great man. We know that it's difficult for him to talk about race. He talks about race, polls go down. He takes a dive. But hey, when you talk about Iraq, the same thing happens. When you talk about the economy, the stuff happens. When you talk about the environment, so take a chance with us. We don't mind, right? Secondly, black people have coddled Obama in a way that is destructive to his legacy. It's hard to say in front of white folk and others, but I gotta say it, right? The fact is that, look, I understand why black people love him. I've been knowing the guy since 91. Dig him, love his stilo, his aesthetic articulation of black masculine cool. I dig all of that. I get that. But because we have been so in his corner, no matter what he does, that is always right, that because the obstructionist, white supremacist, bigoted quarters of America are arrayed against him, all of which is true, that we then exempt him from critical responsibilities to American citizens who happen to be African American or Latino, right? So you got to tell that truth. And then I'll end by saying, so I want President DeGioia to use his Georgetownian influence to ask the president to hold here at Georgetown a conference on the state of race in America and invite President Obama to come. I think he can do it. I think he can do it. I think he can do
it.
Peter.
Well, he did it again. Either I got to get my name changed to starting with A, or we're going to change Michael's to beginning with Z. And A to Z as well. This is a university that stands for justice. And it is, many of us in this room have been here a long time. Some of you are new members of this community, and you already know, and you will see more. But the challenges are there for us to do much better on these issues. They are always there. And this conversation today is an absolutely wonderful start of a school year at a tragic time. For this kind of a conversation to be going on in this university all the time, to challenge members of our colleagues, wherever it is relevant, to include these questions of justice in all respects in the way they teach, whether it's about race, whether it's about gender, whether it's about sexual orientation, disability, everything. We need to explore, to dig down deeper about the quality of our democracy. And about what is happening about voting in our country. How do we educate our children?
You're the man. You're the man. Oh, that's true.
And another thing that we stand for is connecting to the community. And being out there ourselves and being helpful and understanding so much better in a first-person way what's going on out there every day. Understand how our criminal justice system works. Paul, you take your students out there in that police car. All of the ways that are analogous to that. We have to, and I don't want to presume on people's political positions here, although there's a certain indication in the response to the speakers. We need to work toward a politics in our country that brings us to different outcomes on all of these issues that we're talking about. So the challenges are there, and we really need to be much more conscious about moving forward and struggling for justice in our country.
Well, I'd put forth an idea, but Reverend Dyson, as I call him, the man with the words, was able to articulate it in a much more refined and provocative way. You know, when President Johnson went to Howard, it was at a white university. And here a white man went and proposed ideas that were, as he put it, save the nation. And so my idea would be that here at a white university, a predominantly white university, a black president come and have the opportunity to put forth ideas that can preserve the nation. And it's nothing aside, it's nothing, it's an open invitation to say, we can use this university because every time I look up, you have a Secretary of State, a president come and they give their ideas on different political positions. So let's do it on this. It is just the most natural thing in this city, in a welcoming arm. And if you want to, we'll tell him then Dyson won't be here that day. He'll be in Detroit visiting his family.
That will greatly increase the opportunity, I'm sure.
A second, I think, and I think we have to figure this out. Why is it whenever I see a poll on Ferguson or anything related to race, and not just African Americans, but it can be related to immigrants on the border, anything else, that the opinions of whites and blacks are almost at the opposite. It just doesn't make, it doesn't make sense. We're in the same world. And I would like for Georgetown to do a study, a forum on why this is so. Because white people, Du Bois says there's nothing that is ever done in America that has helped the black person and hasn't helped the white person more. Now, does it make sense? Reconstruction, public schools, public hospitals, the New Deal, we talk about it, but a sense of veterans benefits, affirmative action. I often joke, people say, well, affirmative action helps black people. I say, they say, what can we do? I say, it's 3 words, ask your mama. And what I meant by this is if you are white and your mother is white, affirmative action has also helped her reach past that glass ceiling. So there was nothing wrong with it. So let's look at that. And I think we have to really ask ourselves, because I can't figure it out. It makes no sense to me. The last thing is that, and I'll take it to the city of Washington, which I'm working on right now. I know there was applause when someone mentioned, the question of our brother's keepers, but let's look at it, and let's look at it this way, though. African American men in Washington, D.C. go to school, college at a rate that is less than 10%. The great majority drop out. And so there is a specific condition of African American men that is affecting the nation. It affected St. Louis, it affected Ferguson. And what I think Georgetown could do, if you want to go to medical school and you don't do well, there's a baccalaureate program. So you can go. You go for 18 months. I think that Georgetown should, and I'll work with whatever school of education it should be, to work with the D.C. public schools to identify young African-American men who may have potential but can't reach it right there. And to maybe work with schools like Georgetown Prep or Georgetown Day or St. Albans or places where they can sleep overnight, a program so that we can develop our own pipeline. Because as I look in class, there's so few African-American men are going to school here, unless they, okay, basketball players, the guys come football, they're no bigger than me, so they're not going to make it. They could be very good players, but if you're no bigger than me, you're not going to make it. And I'm 6'2", so it's a different. So, but I think we can figure that out, and we have to do that. 3 things: the idea of a White House conference, the idea of the question of the study of the education of blacks, and the question of how we can have a better pipeline for African American male in the school.
So I guess the university does 2 things primarily. We do research and teaching. And I think if we're really going to be serious about this, we need to invest in the programs and the capacity of the faculty to do research on race. In American government, in my department, we don't have someone who teaches on race. I do some things on that, but that absence leads to an absence of knowledge at the university that has consequences. So it's a very important thing to do. I think we should have the African American Studies program be a major in a department. And I think these are, when you create institutions, knowledge follows. And so the capacity of the university to build those institutions will build the knowledge that will ideally benefit the country. For students in teaching, we need to develop students that have the capacity to understand and talk and work within not just racially diverse communities, but really understand how race works. Race is a relation, it's not a category. And so this idea that students have the skills white students have the skills, in particular, to engage and start conversations and to be leaders about race is exceptionally important. So we need to help our students develop those capacities because without that, we are going to be growing farther apart, and it's essential.
So I think it appropriate before we start the Q&A to thank these folks. So we have about 15 minutes. Those of you who would like to orally present your question, line up. I can start while you're lining up with questions that came through on the cards. So first, this is to the panelists. Do you think that marches and movements are still an effective vehicle for change? Or do you believe that voter mobilization to political reform through elected representatives will yield more results? Who wants a shot at that? Marcia.
That's not an either-or proposition. You can't have one without the other. And I think that as much as I, try to make sure that students understand that every ballot you cast is dipped in the blood of real martyrs for the cause, the false notion that if you vote a lot, then you are fulfilling your contract as a citizen is a false notion, so don't believe that. You are a citizen when you understand the terms in which your community needs things and you are willing to exhaust every strategy to secure that. So it's not an either or, it's a both and.
So maybe you could identify yourself before you do your question.
My name is Nabil. I'm a senior in the SFS. And we talked a lot about what Georgetown can do and sometimes how America's institutions are sometimes exclusive. So my question is a bit challenged to Georgetown. Isn't the very institution we are pretty inherently exclusive? I mean, the tuition we charge is more than the median family income in the United States. Frankly, the kids who go here grew up in neighborhoods like I did. They didn't grow up in Compton. They don't grow up in Ferguson. And so my question is, if we really are serious about Georgetown playing a role in fixing the moment of Ferguson, I mean, don't we have to really challenge the very foundations of the institution that frankly contribute to sometimes the exclusive nature of America?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, look, nobody's prouder of that question than President DeGioia, right? Because, and Provost Groves, because, and your fellow teachers, and your student, because we want you to raise serious questions about the contradictions. They're inherent contradictions in all of us speaking about an issue. But as Professor Chatelain said, we may not all be from Ferguson, but the consequences of Ferguson are mobile. So yes, we have to constantly interrogate the foundations of radical inequality. We have to talk about the kinds of students we invite to join us here at Georgetown. We have to talk about the exclusionary practices that are unconsciously reproduced by the very existence of an institution like this. But we also have to challenge ourselves to take advantage of those opportunities to raise the kind of questions you're raising, and when you graduate, to do even more to make certain that the consequences of your question, that is to say, how do we get more equitable distribution of resources among vulnerable populations? Because I happen to be from those populations, grew up poor and black in Detroit. And so it's not that I don't want Georgetown to exist, I just want more people that I know who come from that neighborhood and others like it to be at a Georgetown. So I don't want to send Georgetown away. I want Georgetown to be here. I just want different kind of folk to be here as well as we raise those serious questions about our contradictions and the blood on our hands. And I heard somebody on Twitter the other day challenge, hey, students who have been progressive about the Coney situation,
who are outraged about that to get outraged about what's going on in Ferguson. So all of us, if I look at my own class status now, I've got to interrogate my own particular biases, prejudices, and privileges relative to others to make sure that I'm using my bully pulpit to inform and to enforce. So my point is, you're absolutely right. There's no easy resolution of that. There's a way of asking the question structurally so that we include more people. There's also the way of having our classes reflect the kind of knowledge that can be produced to help inspire a closing of that gap. And then finally, the responsibility of all of us is to make certain that the kinds of knowledges, perspectives, and values that people that we know who don't come to Georgetown possess are present here, not simply by proxy, but by our appropriation, in the best sense of that word, of the knowledge that they produce so that we're able to carry forth that legacy. So it's no easy resolution. It's a both and, not an either or.
Thank you. So I think this is a question that both Paul and Marcia spoke to. What is your stance on the way the mainstream media covers the issues of race and the militarization of local police forces? Paul, do you want to?
I think the media put a little too much emphasis on the small minority of violent protesters in Ferguson. So there was almost this false equivalence between people who were looting on the one hand and this over-militarized police force that was presenting stun grenades to largely peaceful protesters. So, there's no equivalence there. I think that the protesters at Ferguson were largely citizens, patriots in the finest tradition. I'm glad that they were there, because if they weren't there, then we wouldn't be here now.
Good evening. My name is Nicole McCann Ramirez, and I am a freshman at the SFS. My question is for Professor Butler. Understanding that the conflict in Ferguson goes beyond simply the murder of Michael Brown and the protesting and the consequences beyond that, what do you believe the militarization of police forces, as well as those abuses of power we saw in the press, connotate for the American people? Do these types of legislations and decisions to provide such excessive amount of power to police forces indicate a sense of paranoia or fear in legislators toward the potential restlessness and almost a sense of uprising present in many minorities, or is it connotative of something else?
I'd say, part of where this 1033 program came from that supplies local police departments with surplus military equipment is from the war on drugs. And we know that is a war that is raced, where African Americans are selectively incarcerated. If you go to the National Institute of Health about 2 miles up Wisconsin Avenue, they'll tell you about 13% of people who use drugs are African American. And then if you go down to the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice statistics, about 2 miles in the other direction in this great city, they'll tell you about 60% of people who are incarcerated for drug use are black. So 13% of people who do the crime, 60% of people who do the time. And there's a whole legal apparatus that enables that. So part of it is, yes, this issue of not just paranoia, but race paranoia. And then part of it is, this larger ongoing conversation that we're having, not just about inequality, but also about civil liberties.
Actually, Maurice, this next question might be a good one for you. How can we take the lessons of Ferguson and apply them here in Washington, D.C., a place that also has high inequality and poverty prevalent within the black community?
One question related to that, and I think Peter spoke about it, about all the fines and everything that happened. People go to jail. It's a shame, but D.C. is almost a model after that. Because if you go to Washington, D.C., in Ward 7 and Ward 8, they have the exact same rules. And so it's a city run by blacks with but with white police, but blacks, that you have the same, using revenue to pay for the city. It is almost shameful because you don't have those traffic cameras over in Ward 3 or down River Road and places like that. You just have them in Ward 7 and Ward 8. So the same purpose. Poverty in Washington is a bit different to understand because it shifts so much. The average white family in D.C. makes $101,000. The average black makes $39,000. But we know the average white family makes much more than $101,000. The average black family makes much less than $39,000. It's because of the influx of young people come in who bring the white average down. And I often used to tell my kids when they were in the house, I said, you don't know a single poor white man, and you don't know a single rich black one. Now I was exaggerating a little bit because they are moderate income whites, and there are some very well-off blacks. But the poverty is such a rate. Now, here's the big question in Washington, D.C., is because people assume that those who are leaving the city are the poor, but it's not the case. The poor got nowhere to go. It's mainly the middle income people, and the middle income people leave because they can't pay for a house and for that private tuition at the same time, so they choose to go to a PG County or places like that. So what happens in a place like Washington, D.C., and you see it again when we talk about drugs. You go to Adams Morgan, 90% of the arrests for pot smoking are black. But 90% of the pot smoking in Adams Morgan is white. So even in a place like Washington, D.C., you have those things because we've also accepted the norm there. So what I think about Washington is that in a way it could be a model city. The problem is, and it's a very simple problem, is that in Washington, people here do not control anything. They don't control the budget. They don't control, so everything written, every law written, it goes back to Congress. And so you have that. The only way to change that is through Congress. Here's the problem, though, and it goes back to another question. I think you could find someone that's done a study all over America. There is no more room for the election of more black elected officials. It's about at the top it's going to go. So what has to be done now, if black people are going to be elected, they'll have to be elected either in white districts or have to be progressive whites who are going to pay attention to the needs of blacks. That's why I keep going back. It's so important. Georgetown has more congressmen, I think, President DeGioia, is it not true? More congressmen than any other university. And so we're training people. We're training. We hope we have some. Don't we have a black guy who's a congressman now? Or he ran in Queens or something like that, don't we? He ran in Queens, didn't he? Don't we have I know a black graduate. So I'm saying, so you have so many policymakers coming from this school. They can make that influence. It may be 5 or 6 years down the road. So all this affects to Washington, D.C. The last thing about Washington, D.C., and I often joke, is Charlie Deacon here? I once joked with Charlie, and I said, Charlie, why don't you have more blacks coming to school here? I think his numbers are going up. And so he said, well, Maurice, they want to leave town. And I said, Charlie, coming to Georgetown is leaving town. So we can do more to bring African Americans to this school. Thank you.
So we have about 4 minutes left. I think I'll take 2 more, and I won't do any more cards, and we'll take the first 2 folks here in front. So go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Vaughn Meyer, and I'm a second-year graduate student in the MSFS program. And I'm from Chicago, but I spent a lot of my time growing up in socioeconomically disadvantaged, almost 100% white communities in rural Illinois and rural Indiana. And these are communities that oftentimes have very low education levels. And it's totally different to talk about race issues, any of these issues, but specifically race issues in Chicago or at Georgetown than it is to talk in these rural, all-white, socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. And it's always been a question for me of how do I bring this conversation to those areas, to the people I know there, in a way that they will hear and that can actually hopefully make an impact on people who do vote and who do choose leaders, but who don't actually think that racism exists.
Paul, I think you were, Peter.
I just want to relate my experience not as a white person, but as a person who previously lived and worked and enjoyed the state of Oklahoma, where I met a lot of white students who say, I don't know what white privilege is. I'm struggling in a rural community. I have a failing school. And I think that the terms of engagement have to be about this idea of safety, community, the things that are incredibly precarious for people of color, that even in these white rural communities, these structures that they kind of idealize the disruption of that. So I think that there's an entry point. And second, I think there's been some wonderful economic justice issues around labor that have reached those communities, and they are asking new questions. And I think what Reverend Barber is doing in North Carolina in organizing poor whites is really a model for how to have these conversations based on economic justice issues in order to forge those alliances. And I think that's such a thoughtful question.
Just very quickly, resonating with that, there are more people who are poor in this country who are white than any other group. And what we have here is a tremendous challenge to be able to kind of keep, for the country, to have two ideas in their head at the same time. Because there are obviously the questions about race that we're talking about, and then the fact that 44% of the poor are white, is millions and millions of people who don't feel like they're part of the conversation. And part of that is that we don't have a politics that includes people who are white, who are having a very, very tough time. And particularly when you add up the struggles in this country, it's way, way more than the question of who's technically poor. There are 106 million people in this country who have incomes below twice the poverty line. There's a lot of white people in that. We need to figure out how to create a politics that includes everybody. I was in upstate New York this summer talking to a bunch of teachers, and it was about poverty. Every one of them came, it was for the union. Every one of them was from a place where the poor kids were all white. I mean, the conversation we were having would be educational, but not relevant as an action matter. So thank you for that.
I think very briefly, there's been a lot of whiteness studies that have come out from some remarkable scholars in history, in politics, and in culture, and it would be worth taking a look at the way in which whiteness is a product, politically speaking, of American identity that then despises blackness or even native identities in a certain way. But as Martin Luther King Jr. said, to his jailer in Birmingham, hey, you got more in common with me than you got in common with the people who are the overlords of both of us.
Exactly.
And so if we can get poor white people to understand there is less advantage in the wages of whiteness that are paid to you for having an ethnic solidarity with other white people versus the kind of substantive solidarity you can have with all peoples who are poor across a color line, then United has a much more powerful possibility of getting everything that the poor white person wants along with what the other poor people want. But the problem is the psychology of racism has assigned such a high value on animus toward blackness that people end up becoming martyrs and impaling themselves on their own biases as they bleed and starve, but hold on to an anti-black, racism. And I think if we give that up, it's good for business and it's good for white folk who are poor to give up anti-blackness because there's a lot more in the offing.
Hi, my name is Brandon Anderson. I'm a sociology major, senior, and I'm originally from Oklahoma. I wanted to touch on a couple of things that Professor Butler had mentioned originally at the beginning of the conversation regarding My Brother's Keeper and Barack Obama's initiative towards fixing young black men, not necessarily doing things that would uplift them or deconstructing the systems in which they live in order to progress. And I was raised in Oklahoma, short story, then a question. I was raised in Oklahoma, and I lived around rich white and black folk. I lived in a 6-bedroom home, and this past weekend I went to Ferguson, and I really thought that I could use my privilege as an affluent, quote unquote, African-American male and do some good. I had a rude awakening when I realized that my European cut tailored shirt didn't excuse me from racism, or that my good Negro behavior didn't remove me from the stodgy old neighbor of white supremacy. And one thing that it taught me is that politics of respectability gets us nowhere. Me pulling up my pants doesn't change the fact that 4,000 schools have been shut down within our communities, doesn't change the fact that although black people and black-owned businesses are the greatest private employer to black people, yet we spend our money in these communities in which continue to take from us, take our money off from underneath the bulletproof glass windows, sell us inferior goods, and then move to the other side of town, spending our hard-earned money to send their kids to our schools and schools like this. So I had a rude awakening at that moment that pulling up my pants or wearing the kind of shirts that I see on Wall Street or television or even up on this panel would change the way I was represented. So the question here to us today is, how do we move past how we are seen? How do I change my attire? Not my shirt, but how would I change the way I appear to black people, to white people, and especially the police?
I'm not sure I get the point.
I don't really.
One of my students.
He's doing well.
He's doing very well. He's doing very eloquently stated, but I think the problem is you can't change your appearance, as you know. And it was what Professor Butler said, fixing the keeper, or really the killer, of my brother. He didn't say that, that's just a Dysonian interpolation. So the problem is not so much, although fixing ourselves is buying into the very logic that was promoted even during, and I don't want to name any names, even during the height of Ferguson, the politics of respectability. People blaming black people for what, you can act a certain way, you can riot, and you're going to get treated that way if you don't riot. The people in Ferguson weren't rioting before they were rioting. Right? They weren't rioting before they were rioting, but they were being treated in a disrespectful, dehumanizing fashion, which was not being heard. Martin Luther King Jr. even said that riots are the language of the unheard. He didn't justify them, but he certainly didn't preach sermons or give out moral lectures about the necessity for a certain kind of respectability in place of serious, solid, substantive analysis, politically speaking, of what was going on. So yeah, black people ourselves have bought into this. The president has become lecturer-in-chief of telling black people this stuff he would say at Morehouse, which is downright ridiculous. He's acting as if the people at Morehouse were in prison, and yet he goes to Barnard College and he would never tell white women, hey, stop complaining about sexism, but he feels free to tell black people stop complaining about racism. So that the real tragedy of Obama's silence on race is that the only time he speaks about race is to chide black people. Giving the perception to white America, aha, it lets us off the hook, because the problem ain't the fact that we're engaging in institutional racial practices that have been subordinating black people over centuries. It's the fact that Negroes really won't pay attention to their own pathologies within their own culture. This is where Moynihan meets a megaphone that then triples the damning effect on black people. So I would say we got to do a couple things. First of all, it's not that we don't want to behave in a certain fashion that reflects our own moral and ethical commitments, but the politics of respectability misses the kinds of concerns we have, as you say, that even when people are well dressed, the president of the United States of America is a Harvard graduate, has been called everything but a child of God, has acted and behaved in the appropriate fashion, and yet he has been demonized. So he only needs to look in the mirror to understand that acting right don't mean you're gonna get treated right. That's number one. But number two, then black people have to give up the addiction to a certain kind of self-loathing that gets dressed as tough love. Because if you're going to do the tough love thing, you got to do the other thing. I was in a room, if I can take a point of personal privilege, with Barack Obama before he ran for president. Me, him, and Chris Rock. We're in Oprah's crib in Santa Barbara. I ain't saying it for that. I'm just telling you this. Chris Rock says to Obama, I heard it with my own ears. Because Obama's always quoting Chris Rock, but he don't quote all of Chris Rock. Right? Because he quotes Chris Rock, and Chris Rock says, Negroes always want something good for something they should be doing. They want to get rewarded for stuff they should be doing. I take care of my kids. Chris Rock said, you should be taking care of your kids. So Obama quotes that part, but he won't quote what Chris Rock told him to his face. He said, my daddy told me that you can't beat, if you're a boxer in a ring, you can't beat a white man just by outpointing him. He said, you got to knock them the hell out. Now, Obama will speak against black people in terms of the need for self-criticism, but he won't ever represent us in telling the truth to white America about some of the vicious occurrences that happen on the daily. As Professor Butler said, translation is one thing, but that's always hat in hand trying to tell them why the Negroes are upset and why the native masses are somehow uprising. But it's a bigger issue and a more brave one to transform, not to translate. To say to white America, but there are things that you must do to make sure that this does not perpetuate a legacy of inequality. So the point is, you can't change what you do. I don't want to stop being black. I just want people to get over their feelings and fears about my blackness. I don't want to stop doing this. I've been 55 years in this game. I don't know how to be nothing else. So the point is, we don't change our dress, we change the way in which America understands the humanity of black people, regardless of their dress, whether they have a hoodie on, whether they have an academic hood on. We are to be respected and treated, and black people must stop the kind of internal rhetorical violence against vulnerable black people. Maybe if you lifted their dreams, their pants would follow. If you can then lift their possibilities, not that I'm saying raise your pants, but I'm saying if you are that obsessed with sartorial splendor, black legislators have spent money and political capital to outlaw sagging pants. That is a waste of our capital. What we must do is lift the vision of the culture about who we are as people of color, and then the standards get lifted and hopefully the politics gets transformed. But off the top of my head, that's what I would say to you.
So we're way over time, but I thank all of you for coming. This is what Georgetown does well. We engage in discussion, respectful dialogue. These people need our thanks. Thank you very much.